Welcome, viewers, to an AUK, Atheism UK video, in which I've got some great news, because we have a new branch, Atheism UK Northern, and I've got one of the key people here to tell us all about it. And let us hear the presentation that he made at the inaugural meeting. Welcome, Guy Otten. How the devil are you, Guy?
I'm good, thanks. Yes, despite the reference to the devil, I'm good.
And you'd like to mention your co-conspirator, Jeffrey Berg, wouldn't you?
Yes, Jeffrey Berg, also a member of the Council of Atheism UK, and we also have a third conspirator called Ranja Aziz, who's an asylum seeker. Yes. And following our first meeting, we've actually got three more people who want to join our coordinating group. So we feel quite lifted by that experience, really.
Our tendrils are spreading.
Yes. Yeah. Mm.
So what we have today is the presentation that you gave at the inaugural meeting in Manchester.
Yeah.
But forthcoming, we've got a presentation lined up from Jeffrey.
Yes, on the 2nd of March at the Ostrich pub in Bury Old Road in Prestwich in Manchester at 7:30 in the evening. So Jeffrey Berg will speak about arguments for atheism. He wrote a book about 14 years ago called The 6 Ways of Atheism. He's going to essentially talk about some of the matters that he discusses in some of the chapters of his book. So that should be, very good, I think. It's the sort of thing that I think we want to do as a Northern Atheist group, is to deal with the basics of atheism, so that people who are inquirers or thinking about it can come along, hear our point of view.
Doubters and deconstructors.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes. I'm desperately trying not to make some sort of horrible pun about the Ostrich pub. And
I know. Yeah, it's a problem, isn't it? But anyway, there we are. We face it down, and it's a talking point. The Ostrich pub. It's a funny little pub, but they've welcomed us and they've given us a room very near the entrance, so it's very satisfactory, really. The only problem is that we can't quite work the Wi-Fi out there, right. But hopefully we'll.
You're playing into my hands here, because face it down is what ostriches do, of course, and, and that's why I was trying to avoid the pitfall of mentioning bury, because it's burying the head. No.
Yes, that's right. Bury Old Road and the Ostrich.
Don't tempt me to go there. Anyway,
it's fatal.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway,
we'll have to actually ask you to come and talk to the group at some stage, but we'll hopefully if you're available.
I'd be happy to do that. Thank you for the invitation, Guy. You know that if you give me a microphone, I'm a sucker. You can't stop me. Yeah. Anyway, we're going to go through your presentation, because at the first meeting it was you as the speaker, and I'm going to put that on screen with us now, and you can talk to it, and I'll change the slides.
Okay? Lovely. Thank you very much. Right. Well, I like to start with a slide from Christopher Hitchens. Religion is poison because it asks us to give up our most precious faculty, which is that of reason, and to believe things without evidence. And my talk is about evidence, which is, I think, central to the debate between theists and humanists or atheists. It's central too to medicine, science, philosophy, law, politics, public administration, etc. And it's central to our understanding of the world. It's key to how we discover what we can discover and know what we think we know. Next slide, please. So I approach this topic having spent a career in the law, where evidence, of course, is of central concern when it comes to settling disputes and finding guilt. But inevitably, I'm now focusing in today's talk on the Abrahamic God idea. There are other God notions, such as the Spinozan, I list them there: pantheist, Wiccan, polytheist, animist, sea of faithist, etc. But I think the basic principles probably apply across the board. Similarly, what I'll be saying is the basis, I think, of a healthy skepticism. Next slide, please. So atheists doubt that any evidence of the natural world could actually demonstrate the existence of an alleged supernatural entity or phenomenon, such as the typical God is claimed to be. Incidentally, I'm beginning to think that supernatural is actually a term we should avoid. It's essentially non-natural, isn't it?
I thoroughly agree. If I can interrupt there, I prefer to say unnatural.
Well, unnatural has its own nuances, but yeah, it's not natural. In other words, it's a fantasy until it's proved to exist.
Yes.
However, some theists do claim that their God intervenes in the natural world or manifests in some way, and they obviously hope to overcome what would otherwise be an insurmountable evidential problem, namely to try and prove something that doesn't manifest in nature. So by saying that their God intervenes in the natural world, then they open themselves up to the alternative problem of showing evidence of their God's intervention. If a God could be demonstrated by evidence, then that God would be a natural phenomenon, I think. So theists who say their God is supernatural and unknowable are in effect accepting that their God is undemonstrable and therefore unprovable, which is why ultimately many theists rely on faith. Next slide, please. And faith, of course, is what Matt Dillahunty calls the excuse folk give when they don't have good evidence or reason to believe. And our case is that evidence always outweighs faith, as per the slide. For atheists who are at least not convinced that a supernatural reality actually exists, the lack of good evidence for the existence of a God is strongly suggestive that no such thing exists, particularly as we think it's reasonable for a God who is concerned with the world to be capable of being shown to exist. In our discussions with theists, atheists are often heard to say there is no evidence of a God, but I don't accept that proposition because I think there is evidence, but that it's bad evidence, essentially, for the reasons I'll set out now in the rest of this talk. Next slide, please. So what actually is evidence? Well, this is a definition. Some fact, information, or statement or thing that helps us determine the truth or otherwise of another fact, proposition, claim, or allegation. This is a legal definition. I appreciate that scientists and other academic fields may look at it from a different point of view. So what is evidence? So next slide, please. What types? Oh, well, of course, is that evidence? Is that evidence that there's no God? I don't think so. Next slide.
I've got a gadget that you can impress on a piece of bread. And when you put it in the toaster, it comes out with the face of Jesus.
All right, exactly. Well, there you are. Mind you, if you did that and you then advertised it, you might get substantial offers of money for the purchase of.
Well, you can. It's a product. You can find it on Amazon, I'm sure.
Right. So what types of evidence are there? Next slide, please. So these are the main types of evidence, certainly that we think of in legal terms. Firstly, the oral evidence of witnesses, including confessions. Secondly, written documents, including things like maps, graphs, indeed photographs. Thirdly, real evidence, what lawyers call real evidence, objects like the knife used in a stabbing, coins, inscriptions, archaeological evidence, fossils, Hadrian's Wall, for instance, is a piece of real evidence. And then there are expert evidence, scientific and opinion evidence, photographs and CCTV, computer-generated evidence. I'm not going to be talking about the last three very much, because the first three are the real ones to focus on. Next slide, please. So some of these types of evidence are primary evidence. Now, primary evidence is evidence given by those who witnessed or had first-hand knowledge of the facts they're giving evidence about, or they are objects which are in themselves pieces of direct relevant evidence. That's primary evidence. Other types of evidence are hearsay or second-hand evidence, and they are necessarily of much poorer quality, as we will see. And it's a basic principle of law, and I think of pretty much every other field, that you want the best quality evidence that's going.
Can I ask you a question there?
Yeah.
How credible in court is hearsay evidence? Is it given any credibility or what?
There are different rules in criminal courts and civil courts.
Yes.
So by and large, in criminal courts, hearsay is not permitted,
Yes.
with some exceptions. In civil courts, hearsay is permitted, but the court has to consider its quality. And obviously, what I'm going to say is relevant to that matter.
Thank you.
So next slide, please. So then the different categories of evidence just described have to be identified and understood in order to get to grips with the credibility of any piece of evidence. So credibility is about how believable a piece of evidence is, given the world we live in and our experience of it, the laws of physics, etc., we're all subject to. A mundane fact, for instance, is my claim that I'm wearing a wristwatch. This is a commonplace thing, eminently believable, and in any case, nothing really turns on it, and it's usually very easily provable. In fact, I'm actually not wearing it. I've taken it off. But that's so. But
contempt of court.
Yeah, they are caught out there. By contrast, the claim that a virgin gave birth to a god contradicts everything we know about how the human body works. Although virgin birth or parthenogenesis is not unknown in the animal world, it's not been demonstrated to occur in the human world and is inherently improbable.
Or in any mammal or bird.
Right, thank you. Such a claim therefore requires compelling and high quality evidence to get over the line of credibility, and that's missing. And also, of course, I haven't started on the God part of the claim either. Also, under the question of credibility is the important question of why this particular witness is giving the evidence. What is the motivation of the witness in creating that document or other evidence under consideration? And then further under the question of credibility is the thorny question of the witness's honesty and character. Now, there was a change in the UK criminal law many years ago, which has possibly influenced prosecutors not to embark on prosecutions where they fear the complainant's character, including previous convictions, makes the testimony of the complainant as a witness less believable to a jury.
Oh, that's interesting, because that's something that Prince Andrew is trying with his forthcoming case in the USA, isn't it? He's trying to credit the accuser.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this has always been done, but I mean, if you're a prosecutor and you're thinking, have we got over the line of probably sufficient evidence to result in a conviction, and the public interest is served by this prosecution. If you've got a complainant and the complainant is central to the case, as is often the case in a rape charge, for instance, and the complainant has themselves
Dubious character.
had issues of her character. That, I think, that is often why, or that may be why, the prosecution rate of rape cases is so low. And this is a major problem that the government and the legal profession has got to get to grips with. Anyway, that's a side issue. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned motivation and there's also issues of perception I'm going to mention, and internal incredibility and contradictions in their account. These are also aspects that I'm going to focus on a bit more in the rest of this talk. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus, as I say, mainly on hearsay now for a bit in documentary form, because that really is one of the main forms of evidence relied on by theists, if not the primary form of evidence. Essentially, scriptures are hearsay, as I'm going to explain. So even directly witnessed evidence, however, that isn't hearsay can be problematic. Let me just say that first. As different witnesses will see the same event from different angles, and with different preconceptions of what they might be seeing, and perhaps subject to different suggestions or biases that affect what they think they see.
Yes. So even eyewitnesses are not 100% trustworthy.
Exactly. That, and I'm going to give some examples of that shortly.
Well, can I just interpose that I've had as my guest on my show and in real life in Worthing Skeptics, I've had a lecturer who I think is now a professor who specialized in examining the reliability of eyewitnesses. So I'll probably put a link to that in the details underneath this video.
Well, that's very interesting. And of course, there's some really good examples I'll mention in a minute. So courts are already hesitant to accept even first-hand evidence without checking it, and being able to question and cross-examine and so forth. But hearsay evidence takes this problem much further. Right at the heart of legal thinking about evidence is the problem of hearsay evidence, whether oral or written. And scriptures, for instance, the Gospels and the Quran, are obvious examples, unless you, of course, believe that they were dictated or inspired by a god. And of course, the problem there is it's circular. If you're trying to prove a god by reference to a scripture that you say was influenced by God, well, then, it's not independent.
Can I pose something else right now? Because there are a number of different interpretations of the word witness, one of which would require that person to be produced in court for cross-examination. Now, what's your view on the meaning of witness? Should it have that addendum?
No, I don't think it should, because if you take a typical, say, criminal case, you might have, say, 10 witnesses for the prosecution, of whom 5 are procedural witnesses who simply make a statement which is not contested, but they just connect a document from one place to another or something like that. And so they are witnesses, but their evidence is contained in writing, and they're not called to the court. I mean, they can be called if the defense wants to call them, but they're not usually called. So they're still witnesses, but their evidence is accepted without, and it's accepted essentially in written form, although their witness statement will probably be read to the court.
So it's not compulsory, part of the word witness, to be cross-examinable.
No. Cross-examinable, yes, but but not necessarily called for cross-examination if the witness's evidence is not contested. So next slide, please. So hearsay evidence is second-hand testimony, as I've mentioned already. when the witness makes statements not about what they themselves have witnessed, but about what he or she has heard from another person, then that is secondhand evidence. And that other person who is not present to confirm that statement and be questioned about it, if that other person was present, then that would be primary evidence. So that other person from whom they have heard the evidence may themselves also have heard it from a third person. And so you can get third-hand or multiple-hand hearsay. And anyone who has played the game of Chinese whispers, I'm not sure if you were allowed to say Chinese any longer, but whispers say, will readily understand how unreliable multiple-hand hearsay actually is.
Can I give you an example of that?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
This is probably an apocryphal tale, but it's about soldiers in the First World War, and they're in the trenches at the front line, and the captain sends one of the privates back to the headquarters behind the lines, and he sends him with the message, send reinforcements, we're going to advance. Okay. And when he gets back, but he passes through a number of people on the journey, you know, and when the message arrives, it's heard as, send 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance.
I know, that's classic, isn't it? I suspect that might be apocryphal. It sounds like a good joke, but it illustrates the problem, though, that is real. And an example of multiple hand hearsay are religious traditions, because often they have been handed down for some periods, often hundreds of years, before they're actually committed to writing. So the likelihood of errors and distortions creeping in under these circumstances is not just great, it's inevitable. Next slide, please. So even directly witnessed evidence can be problematic. And so I've already mentioned different angles of perception, preconceptions influencing what you see, biases and suggestions by others. And indeed, so next slide, please. Each transmission of an oral story, these are the sorts of problems that could interfere with the accuracy of the transmission. Right? Perceptions and understanding of the receiver as well as of the transmitter. Their personal preconceptions about what they think they're hearing, their hearing and attention level. Very often you're listening to a story and your mind wanders and you miss a chunk out and you don't hear it.
Yes.
You're not paying attention, and maybe your hearing level is not very good as well. So you're not catching all the words. And then their own interpretation or ideas of what the evidence means. You could even include their own intelligence level and ability to actually understand what the evidence is. Then their own culture, its assumptions and its worldview.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's their memory of what they've heard, what they think they've heard. And then people are very suggestive. So if you're in a group of people and you're hearing a story and one person shares what they think the story meant or said, even if it's wrong, the others are likely to agree with that. And then that, again, distorts the transmission. So there are a lot of problems and they are cumulative, is the point I'm making here.
Can I add number 8?
Sorry? Go on. Number 8, yeah.
It's by the teller's desire to go down well with the audience.
Yes. Well, I come to that actually. Down well. Yeah. I'm just making a note of that. Yeah. So
this reminds me of the difference between subjective and objective, because I think my definition of objective would be untainted by a mind.
Right. Yeah.
And so all of these things are up to being tainted, possibly.
the subjective mind process interference. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So next slide, please. Yeah. So I'm now going to take it even. I've talked about the cumulative problems, and I'm going to take it a few stages further now. Worse, some transmitters will have been moved by their strong beliefs to improve, correct, select, emphasize or de-emphasize, or generally edit or change the evidence. And I've got examples of that coming up. Worse still, if the story is told by by way of entertainment, and this is, I think, the point you were making, essentially, its entertainment value is likely to be creatively enhanced at the cost of accuracy.
Especially if you're getting paid.
Well, especially if you're getting paid, absolutely. But even not, I mean, if you think about the ancient world when there wasn't television or radio or anything like that, what there was people sitting around telling stories.
Yes.
And the quality and impact of that story, they had an incentive to enhance the story, to make it more entertaining.
That's right.
In order to get the attention and, be asked even to tell the story.
It's probable that street preaching was a bit like today's busking, and people threw you money for giving them a ripping yarn.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about, 18th century England, the Methodist preachers went round, and they were listened to by crowds who were kind of excited. Yes. This Methodist preacher would turn up, and they were used to the same old rubbish being put out by the vicar, who was half asleep at the time, and he wasn't really interested. He was just getting his pay, whereas these Methodists were inspired and so forth, and they entertained, and so people went and listened to them, and that sort of thing is what was happening probably in the ancient world as well.
A passionate speaker is a good rabble rouser.
Absolutely. And then yet worse still, right? I mean, it just goes on and on, this. If the story is being told by way of religious instruction, its factual accuracy can be further eroded by the teacher to enhance its educational or religious impact. I mean, that stands to reason, but actually that is an important point. You're getting into the realm of propaganda here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, can I mention cherry picking here? Because if you've got an audience and you want to entertain them, then obviously you want the juiciest bits and maybe not the nasty bits from your selection. Yeah,
it could well be. So next slide is Clive James. Religion is an advertising campaign for a product that doesn't exist. I think Clive James said a lot of wise things, and I suspect that's one of them. Yes. Next slide, then, please. Back on the theme of strong beliefs. If you strongly believe something and you're dealing with a piece of evidence that you think is a bit weak, you will want to improve it. You will want to correct it. You will want to, as I say, select, emphasize, or de-emphasize, and edit it. That is done either consciously or even subconsciously. But it's a major issue, I say, in the religious context. So next slide, please. And of course, the ancient world is a world without press or internet and no real facilities to check facts. Limited literacy, no printing. And then I'm going to move on now to the reality of scribes copying books by hand. So ancient documents are particularly problematic because before the age of printing, manuscripts had to be copied by hand, and this inevitably resulted in copying errors, which were compounded over the centuries. So documents were copied by scribes sometimes hundreds of times after they were written. And later scribes very often noticed what they thought were errors by previous scribes and corrected them, thereby sometimes introducing further errors. And scribes also at times interpreted notes written in the margins of a manuscript they were copying, and thinking they were part of the text, incorporated them. On the other hand, sometimes a whole line or even a whole page is missing from the copy. And in fact, thousands of copying errors in the Bible have been found, and thousands are also being found in the Quran. And indeed, even when printing was invented, it's not as if mistakes don't happen in print. The most famous example, and perhaps amusing example, is the Wicked Bible, printed in 1631, which had to be withdrawn when it was found that the word "not" had been omitted from the commandment in Exodus 20:14, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." So red faces all round there. So the next slide, please.
Can I just mention that back in those times, it's likely that there was no sort of dispassionate evaluation of ideas, that everything you heard could be attributed to the teller. And so the value of the information was associated very much with the person delivering it. So he was a sort of a star, an authority. And to an extent, whereas we've abandoned that in science. In fact, the Royal Society, the oldest scientific society in the world, has the motto, nullius in verba, nothing in words. Because we're not interested in personification. We're interested in ideas and facts that anybody can check independently. And
yes, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think the ancient world did have a few stars, people like Socrates, who probably rose above that issue.
Yes.
But I mean, I think that's a very human problem that we still have today.
Yes. Well, certainly theists today still are very impressed by authority. They like to see doctor on the end of your name, or and they like to refer to citations all the time. And they're very keen and they're on hierarchy, so this is the boss of this and another boss is up here. And of course, the ultimate boss is really up there.
This can be a fallacious way of thinking, as I think we know, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's what's it called? The fallacy
of authority, is it?
Yes. I was trying to do the Latin, but that'll do.
So next slide. So and I've mentioned so many problems, and I've tried to build them up on top of each other, and I'm in an accumulation. And here we have yet another layer, translation. So the original books of the Bible were written in Greek or Hebrew, in languages that had to be translated.
And Jesus spoke Aramaic.
Which already the Greek New Testament is translating from Aramaic, exactly. So the problem with translations is, firstly, that the translator has to decide what they think the passage means.
Yes.
And that applies even when the meaning of the original passage was obscure, as is often the case.
Yes.
And then the translator has to come up with something that makes sense, because you can't translate something and talk gibberish, really.
No, it's not like decoding. In different languages have entirely different forms of words for conveying a particular.
I'm going to come to that. You're exactly. I'm going to make that very point. Well, you've made it. But in addition to that, distortions are generated by the different cultural meanings attached to words. Exactly what you've just said, in different languages. So there cannot always, in fact, often there isn't, be one-to-one correspondence of meanings between different languages.
You've only got to look on the labels of bottles to see how many more words you need to convey the ingredients or whatever they're trying to say in French or German, for example, compared to English. And there's usually twice as many.
Yeah, all right. So, and this problem can be seen particularly in the Quran, where experts have found that a substantial percentage of the Arabic Quran was actually ambiguous or obscure. And one theory about that explains that the large percentage of those ambiguous passages in the Quran is that they were actually badly translated from pre-existing Aramaic devotional material and put in the Quran, which is quite interesting. And then, of course, you've got the usual, all the other perceptions and ideological issues that affect the translation. And next slide, please. Next, yeah. This is rather amusing. Can't really see it on the screen, but there is an amusing sort of translation of what Brits often say, and then what they mean, and what people from different cultures think they mean. So I can't actually see it at all. But the first one is, I hear what you say, and what the Brit is meaning is, I disagree, and do not want to
discuss it further.
But what somebody from a different culture may understand is, you're accepting or agreeing what has been said, and that it's quite amusing. If you read down that, you see it as a problem that actually is a real problem.
Yes, so, we have, speaking as an English Brit, that's my heritage, we have a way of speaking between the lines very often. We say something which is diplomatically acceptable, but we've got a hidden meaning which we're trying to get across without offending.
That's right. Yes. And you often hear, there's been a meeting of two politicians, and you hear that they had a full and frank discussion, which we now know means they had a row.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right. Next slide. So I wanted to go back to Lost in Translation, and this is an anecdote from me. I was in East Berlin at a conference in 1973. This is before the end of communism, when East Berlin was in a different state, essentially. And I was examining an English language text which included a phrase, the phrase human rights. And I noticed that the German translation had been translated as bourgeois privileges. And the translator was an Australian communist who obviously interpreted the phrase human rights in accordance with his ideological stance.
Yes.
And I've never forgotten that. I mean, that's a very obvious illustration of the problem, or one of the problems here.
A deliberate distortion.
In his case, deliberate, but because he didn't agree with the concept of human rights. He thought they were bourgeois privileges, anyway. So next slide, please. So I'm now going to talk about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were not written by those people. They were not written by people claiming to be witnesses of the events they describe. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were given to the Gospels by later tradition. No one bearing those names can be actually shown to have written them. No manuscripts exist signed by an author, and the Gospels are therefore hearsay, even though they may have been written within 50, 60 years of the events they describe.
That's a generation or more. It's like me trying to remember what my grandfather said, who died 50 years ago, and tell you about it. It's very unreliable.
Exactly. The likelihood of error, therefore, is substantial even before they were written down. That's assuming there was a truthful and accurate core originally, which is not an assumption I'm ready to make. So next slide, please. And of course, the fact that there are contradictions between the gospel accounts, describing the same events, is significant here. entire websites deal with contradictions, and there's one of them. Next slide, please. So biblical scholars have also concluded that the authors of Matthew and Luke may have had Mark's gospel to hand, or possibly another source they call Q, when they wrote their gospels, because much of Mark is reproduced in their gospels, but they added their own material and corrected Mark in other passages. And here you see the editing process actually embedded and revealed in the New Testament itself. You could say it's a corrupting procedure.
Not to mention the Gnostic Gospels, who got left on the editorial floor.
Well, that's right. They didn't make it into the canon for ideological reasons. Yeah. And the Gnostic Gospels, however, did make it, or some of them, into the Quran, interestingly enough. There's another interesting talk about that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I can give you examples. The Gnostic tradition of Jesus's birth is that he was born under a palm tree, and the palm tree bent its leaves down so that Mary could eat a date, and then a stream of water appeared, and Jesus also starts talking. That's in the Quran as well, pretty much word for word.
Right. He's very advanced if he's starting talking at that stage.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So next slide, please. And of course, here we have these graves of gods, and we think there is actually should be a large cemetery for these gods. But next slide, please.
I have a similar cartoon drawn by my friend Sebastian.
Oh, great stuff. Well, I mean, there's some of these cartoons on Facebook are brilliant. I've just added a few. So, and then, of course, I've already mentioned motivations, but I think the motivation of gospel writers is suspect. The Gospels, letters, and books of the Bible were not written primarily to accurately record facts.
No.
They were surely written as a means of religious instruction and to advance a particular religious line. I've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth mentioning in relation to the Bible specifically. This is the truth. And this makes the documents analogous to propaganda.
Yes.
And the motivation of those writing propaganda is, of course, suspect.
Yeah. Well, once you've got an opportunity to entertain an audience for money, then obviously you're not impartial.
No,
you have a vested interest.
That's right. Absolutely. Especially if you depend on your work as an entertainer.
As an income. And we've only got to look at some of the churches that have resulted from this mythology, like the Roman Catholic Church, to see how wealthy they've become.
Well, I mean, you see the big evangelical churches in the States. They make huge amounts of money.
Yeah, the televangelists.
By putting on a performance.
Yes.
Yeah. I've got to say, when I was a young man, I went to visit Belfast, and I saw Ian Paisley perform twice, and he was very entertaining. Yeah. Next slide, please. And of course, the Gideon Bible, which we find in our hotel rooms. Now, there is you can't see it properly, but there's a sticker being placed on it, which is essentially a warning that the document contains mythology and fiction. And I think you could also arguably put a mental health warning in a Gideon Bible. The very least thing I do, if I'm really sort of tired and stressed, is I open the Gideon Bible and I write at the top, "In case of fire, throw in." But,
I love that.
But I mean, I think arguably, sometimes I remove the thing altogether because they're there for my benefit, and I put it in the recycling, which is a much more beneficial use for the paper.
We should replace it with the God delusion.
Well, yes, that's another good idea. Next slide, please. So I mentioned other forms of evidence apart from, I mentioned real evidence, which are objects. I'm going to talk a bit more about them later. But expert scientific and opinion evidence not normally allowed in courts of law except when it comes from experts whose credentials and experience is such as to mean their expert opinion is reliable and helpful to a court. Forensic evidence is an example of scientific evidence, which is generally admitted if it's coming from a good source. Photographs and CCTV can be very useful. For instance, the dash cam evidence handed to the police at the scene of a road traffic accident. But the source and authenticity of such evidence needs to be checked, as we know it can be tampered with.
Yeah, Photoshop.
And there are special rules about computer-generated evidence. So I'm not going to go into this. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about examples of good and bad evidence now, if we've got time. So the scriptures are not good evidence of what they purport to record for all the reasons I've been giving. Documents are often unreliable, and academics spend much time analyzing ancient texts to try to identify the earliest and hopefully most reliable form. Next slide, please. And so a famous example of a text that has been interfered with is the Testimonium Flavianum. What Flavius Josephus wrote a history of the Jews in the time including Jesus's alleged life. And for several hundred years, that history circulated, and it may have been referred to by the gospel writers. However, after about 300 years, it suddenly, and sorry, I should say Josephus made no mention of Jesus at all. But after a few hundred years, copies circulated which did mention Jesus. And experts or academics think that probably a church father called Eusebius was responsible for inserting a bit about Jesus, which doesn't actually fit the context at all anyway. And so there's an example. Next slide, please.
Can I just interpose there that Josephus was not born during Jesus's existence, allegedly, and there's no record of him having visited what we now call Israel.
I understood that he was part of the resistance against the Roman rule for a while in Israel, but later turned over to the Roman side. But I may be wrong about that. That's my understanding of his as it were CV.
Yes, I wouldn't claim to be an expert.
Yeah, let's go on to slide 32. Now, the standard Islamic narrative, this is another area that I'm particularly interested in, and I actually had a talk about it, could do with updating. But the standard Islamic narrative, or SIN for short, is it purports to explain how Islam arose, but the narrative was actually written at least 100 and up to 300 years after the events they purported to describe. It's clearly the result of multiple hearsay, deliberate forgery, or both. And there was a man called Bukhari who was the principal collector of those traditions, and he rejected over 95% of the traditions, the hadith they call them. He rejected over 95% of them as unreliable or forgeries. And the 5% that he accepted, his methodology in accepting those few, is itself considered flawed by modern experts. So next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, is that it? Sorry, yes, yeah. So even direct testimony can be a problem, and we were mentioning this before. There's the famous example of Our Lady of Fatima. What happened there is in Fatima in 1917, 3 schoolgirls claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared to them, and she would then appear again on the 13th of October 1917. Large crowds gathered to witness this event. They didn't see the Virgin Mary, but they reported seeing the sun zigzagging around the sky and emitting multicolored lights. However, the remaining many millions, billions probably, population of the world at the time did not see any such phenomena. So clearly a mass hysteria or suggestion. Alien abductions, you can still meet people who will give evidence that they have been abducted by aliens. And there are some medical conditions such as dementia, and medications for Parkinson's disease are known to produce illusions or delusions in sufferers. And then we have to deal briefly with personal testimony. I have a personal relationship with Jesus, theists will often say. They say, oh, no, I'm not religious. I just have a personal relationship with Jesus. That's why I know Jesus is existing. Now, the problem with that particular piece of testimony is that although it's primary evidence, so you would have thought it's good quality on the face of it, the problem is one of personal gullibility and readiness to self-delude. The personal testimony of experiences, which cannot be checked objectively, is not really good evidence.
No, well, I would say it's not shareable.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, unless I can have that same experience and everybody can have it, then, it's suspect.
Yes.
And this is where the problem of evidence meets the challenge of mental ill health, because I serve as a humanist chaplain in a psychiatric unit. And my observations of psychotic illness is that psychotic thoughts are often expressed in religious language and imagery, and that it's hard at times to distinguish the boundary between religious devotion, self-delusion, and actual psychosis.
Can I mention here that I frequently interview in my Free Thought Hour show people who have suffered as a result of being brought up in some sect or the other, and subsequently having managed to tunnel their way out of it.
Yeah.
And this leaves them very often, not everyone, but very often with a condition that is recognized as a form of PTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the thing is that the mental patients sometimes tell me they are Jesus. One told me recently that he was King of England and on 25 million a week. I thought, well,
nice job.
Exactly. Or they're the angel Gabriel, and they've been seen Jesus, and Jesus talks to them, and etc. All of these things. I think they're on a spectrum with religious belief.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we're often told is to look at the trees, and the trees are evidence of God, but of course they're not. They're evidence of trees in the natural world.
Well, my complaint there would be, I need a connection. This is a non sequitur fallacy. I need a connection between your God and the trees.
Yeah.
There's no link there.
No, that's right. No provable link. I mean, there may be a link, but we can't see it. We don't know it yet, if there is ever such one. So next slide, please. So what's good evidence now? I'm going to focus on what is. I've talked a lot about bad evidence, but there is good evidence, obviously credible evidence, but evidence that is contemporaneous with the events being described, hopefully. That's not been changed or distorted, and authored by known, reliable, and mentally healthy people who credibly witnessed or recorded recent facts or events that they had personal knowledge of. And then courts will want the chance to check that evidence if possible, question its source. They hope to get corroboration from an independent source.
Yes.
And all of these things contribute, along with, for instance, the evidence not being inconsistent with our common sense understanding of the world.
And of course, there is no independent corroboration of the Bible.
No, or of virgin births in humans. So all of these, if you get all of these factors going for you, then you're looking at potentially good quality evidence, but it's still potentially suspect or subject to some of the problems I've been mentioning.
Yeah.
So examples of good evidence. Next slide, please. For instance, coins that have been lain undisturbed in the ground for centuries since they were lost won't necessarily, well, hopefully won't have been tampered with, and they record accurately whatever facts were put on the coin, which often included the name of the ruler and maybe some item of propaganda that the ruler wanted to put out. For instance, our coins now show the Queen,
Yes.
and the initials FD,
Yes.
meaning Defender of the Faith.
Yes.
So that's a bit of propaganda, which is well past its use-by date, we would say.
Which AUK must campaign against.
Exactly. It's time we got
Yes.
it removed.
Yes.
But I mean, in the ancient world, and this is particularly interesting, the coins that were minted in the 7th century, i.e. in the 70 years after Muhammad's alleged life, do not mention Muhammad, even though he was supposed to be incredibly famous and a bit like Mao Zedong, you know, everyone was going on about him. And similarly, inscriptions, they are also often have been changed. They've just laid there hundreds of years. Well, the same applies. Inscriptions in the area where Muhammad is alleged to have been famous do not mention him before about 700.
Yeah. And would that include, for example, the "In God We Trust" on the US dollar, which was
absolutely, yeah, that's another example. Yeah,
only added in the 1950s.
Yeah, exactly. Things like Tutankhamun's tomb has lain undisturbed for thousands of years and has yielded up much knowledge of the period he lived in. But the point is about the coins and the inscriptions. It really shows that the standard Islamic narrative is probably incorrect.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go on about that to talk about Qiblas. Now, Qiblas are a niche in the wall of a mosque, showing the faithful what direction they're supposed to face, i.e. Mecca, to say their prayers. Now, a man called Dan Gibson has done some amazing research on Qiblas in early mosques. According to Surah 2, verse 144, Muhammad changed the direction of prayer to Mecca from whatever it was before, which was not actually specified. That would have happened sometime between 622 and 632. However, Dan Gibson examined all the outstanding early mosques and found that all mosques built in the 7th century were built with their prayer direction not facing Mecca at all, but facing Petra in Jordan. Amazing. Yeah. So here the evidence is of high quality. Measurements were taken which demonstrate the direction of prayer in the surviving buildings. Not all mosques have survived, and some only survive in, you know, as sort of the foundations have been examined. So Dan Gibson's a very interesting expert. He's written 2 books, Quranic Geography in 2011 and in 2017, Early Islamic Qiblas. They're both very expensive, but he has a good website, which pretty much all of that material is on the website, so people can see it free of charge anyway. And his findings go along a lot of other research, not just on coins and inscriptions, but a lot of other research which show that the standard story, the standard Islamic narrative about its origins is incorrect. So it's a fascinating ism. And I mean, other people like Tom Holland in his famous book, The Shadow of the Sword, have also recorded similar findings. He for instance, wrote, included in his book, a photograph of the ruins of a mosque in Sinai, which has 2 Qiblas. Oh, showing the direction.
Different directions.
Yeah, because it was changed to Mecca from Gibson says Petra. And the mosque was built well after 632 and in a place inconsistent with the change of the direction mentioned in the Quran. So it's another piece of evidence that obviously confirms Dan Gibson.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, all these things have led academics to doubt that Muhammad was the leader and preacher that the standard Islamic narrative alleges him to have been, or that he came from Mecca at all. Indeed, his very existence is put in doubt. So that's and I think Muslims are getting to grips with this evidence slowly, and it's causing a lot of them real heartache and crises, similar to the crises that Christians experienced back, 100, 150 years ago. So slide 36, please. Next slide. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I've mentioned that. There are no inscriptions. I've mentioned that. Yeah. Next slide. Yes, I like this one. Do as I tell you, for I am a sign. Yeah. I just sorry, it doesn't really fit in, but I just enjoy it.
It's the authority thing again, isn't it?
Yeah. I should have put it there, shouldn't I? Where the authority issue comes up.
Yes.
So slide 38. Weight and quality of evidence. Again, the quality of evidence is its credibility and its nature, but the weight refers to how good or bad the evidence is. Sorry, the weight is what effect it has on your decision making. Credibility again, but also weight of evidence can refer to the quantity of good evidence on one side or another. The credibility of a witness may be enhanced by their reputation or standing, impartiality, or even the way they present their evidence. But it can also be damaged by bad reputation and the apprehension of bias or a shifty presentation. That's a problem, because a shifty presentation does not necessarily mean it's not true.
No. Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic presentation, but you have a couple of announcements to make, don't you?
Well, I have. Yes, two announcements. The first one is that this Wednesday, Greater Manchester Humanists have invited Ariane Shireen, who is famous for having started the atheist bus campaign about 12, 13 years ago now.
Yeah.
And she is a comedian and a writer.
And a songstress.
And she's very entertaining. And her humor is quite raunchy. I say that in order to encourage you. So she's speaking in Manchester at the Friends Meeting House, which is in the centre of Manchester, at 7:30 on Wednesday. It's a ticketed event, and the tickets can be had from Eventbrite. So if you go to Eventbrite and then search Darwin Day Comedy, you'll get you'll find her. So so that is a big event for us in Manchester. We hope lots of people will be there. Well, we know lots of people will be there, but we look for more people. So that's the one. That's this Wednesday. So that's first and foremost. The other event is the second meeting of the Northern Atheists group, which is on the 2nd of March at the happily named Ostrich pub in Bury Old Road, Prestwich in Manchester, M25 1JF. Yes, we've had lots of jokes about the Ostrich pub and being in Bury Old Road, but there it is. We face it down and we enjoy the humour and the notoriety of meeting in such a named pub. It's a very convenient little pub. Our room is right near the entrance, and we very much welcome anybody who lives anywhere near to come and join us.
And that's 2nd of March, 7:30?
7:30, Wednesday, the 2nd of March. We are actually meeting as a pattern on the first Wednesday evening of the month. And our plan is to meet at the Ostrich every first Wednesday at 7:30. So put it in your diary. If you can't come on the 2nd, on the 6th of April, I think it is, our third founding member, Ranja Aziz, is going to talk about his experience as a refugee from Muslim threats and oppression in his homeland.
Yes, yes.
That will be a very interesting and important event as well.
That will indeed. We'll plug it nearer the day.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
In the meantime, thank you very much. You have been very entertaining and very informative.
Well, thank you very much. I think these matters are very important, and I think so many theists get away with absolute rubbish standards of evidence, which no one would ever actually rely on in any other context.
A true word has never been spoken. Truer word has never been spoken. Thanks, Guy.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.